Hello and welcome to another episode of The Uncover Up. I'm one of your co-hosts, Lee Kunle, and with me, as always, in the bunker is Professor Nathan Radke.
In the bunker and on YouTube.
Hi, YouTube.
Yeah, this is what we look like. This is what I look like, and this is what Lee looks like.
I feel like people might be disappointed.
Well, there's always that weird moment where you think,
That's not what I thought they looked like.
Mm-hmm. But fortunately, people can still ignore our faces and just listen to this as a podcast.
Exactly.
Right.
We're talking about a story today that I think a lot of people don't know, and yet I think they know it.
Yeah,
but they
it's
know
going to
it
seem really familiar.
Yeah.
But nobody knows the specifics of this story, and this story is very important. This is a very important, foundational flying saucer UFO story.
Yeah.
In particular, because remember back in the summer of 2023, we had that congressional hearing in the United States.
We sure did. David Grush gave that explosive testimony.
Yeah, wild testimony, to the point where if it was true, this would be some of the most important news ever told.
Certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah, because he was making the claim that UFOs had crashed, that the U.S. government had recovered tech from those crashed UFOs.
Yep.
And, quote, non-human biologics.
Right.
And what is a non-human biologic?
It was an odd expression, but it was an awkward expression, but it clearly meant alien something, either DNA or
bodies,
a piece of a body or an entire body.
Yeah, no, importantly, he said that he hadn't seen any of this himself.
Right.
But had been told stories.
Yes.
And so we went into some detail into his claims in another episode.
Yes.
People can go back and listen to that. But today, we're going to look at this idea of recovering non-human biologics, or what we'll say alien corpses.
Yes.
Recovering alien corpses from crashed UFOs.
So you're going to present us with a story that happened quite a while ago, but which, as I suggested earlier, is quite familiar, especially if you have watched The X-Files or if you listen to that testimony. It's a story, I think, that we know in some sense, and this is the origin of it.
Yeah, or this could potentially be the origin of it. So here's the thing. You think about crashed flying saucers and alien bodies. I think most ufologists. Ufologists, most ufologists, when you mention that, are going to think of one place.
Roswell.
Yeah, Roswell.
Obviously.
Which is like the ground zero for this story. So you would think.
I would think this because that mythology of Roswell is also, again, in the X-Files. That's what they say is the origin myth.
Yeah. So in June of 1947, something crashed near the Corona, New Mexico home of a farmer named Mac Brazel.
All right.
And this did happen. This isn't really up for debate. This is a thing that happened. Brazel found Brazel. I always put a bit of a French-Canadian pronunciation on everything, which makes our American listeners, I think, kind of confused and irritated. Brazel.
Okay.
Brazel. So Brazel finds debris in the field, and it's described as some light foil, some light bits of wood, some rubber, and some tape.
Not the kind of material you would imagine you would build an alien spacecraft out of.
I mean, that's a pretty sketchy flying saucer.
Right?
If your flying saucer is held together with tape, that's an issue.
And lumber. Very terrestrial lumber.
I mean, ash is a good hardwood.
Yes, but I'm sure...
I would assume that space ash is even better.
Right, okay.
So he didn't think much of it at the time.
Right.
And also, this was a guy who didn't have a TV, didn't have a radio, and so he was unaware that surrounding him was a bit of a flying saucer mania.
Now, what was this year again?
This was 1947.
Uh-huh.
And this was after...
the other story that we have just recounted in an earlier podcast with Kenneth Arnold. So
Kenneth Arnold,
beginning, the flap of 1947 has begun already.
Yeah, and this is right at the height of it. And so he takes some of it to his uncle, who apparently did have a TV or a radio, and said, hey, something weird crashed in your field. I don't know if you haven't been paying any attention to this, buddy, but we're having a bit of a flying saucer flap here.
Okay.
Maybe this was a flying saucer.
Sure.
And so then, Brazel...
Because, sorry to interrupt you there, Nathan, but...
in the middle of my French accent.
Exactly. I was helping our American listeners. It's not as though the UFO is necessarily extraterrestrial, right? I mean, I know we're in a flap, and I know Kenneth Arnold had sort of put his finger on the scale in terms of the interpretation, but we've also discussed that there are very this worldly explanations of what the UFOs could be.
Yeah, in particular, the Soviets.
Exactly. That's what I was getting to.
Yeah. But now that Brazel thinks that this could be a flying saucer, he takes it to the sheriff of Roswell, which was a nearby town. And the sheriff takes it to Roswell Army Airfield, who sent some officers and soldiers to go out and collect all of the remaining debris. And there's a famous picture of the officer who was in charge of this, Major Jesse Marcel.
Yeah.
And that famous picture that we've all seen and in the video, we're going to put up right now.
Okay.
And in the podcast...
You just have to imagine. The theater of the mind.
Theater of the
right?
mind.
Yes.
Right. And in that, he's sort of sitting there. He's looking kind of confused and a bit amused. And he's surrounded by tinfoil and bits of sticks and tape and some rubber. And then the Roswell Army Public Information Officer puts out a press release stating that the military had gathered the remains of a flying disc. And the public went, huh?
Yeah. That was a bad way of putting that.
Yeah. And then they had another press conference where they said it was a weather balloon. And the public went, huh? They went from huh to meh.
Yeah.
Eh.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was the first time that the government tried to convince us that something was a weather balloon. And the first time that the government was lying
Right.
to tell us that it was a weather balloon because it was not a weather balloon.
It was not a weather balloon. Now,
Yeah.
I just throw this out here. When we were doing the UAP stuff around David Grush's testimony, I watched this wonderful NASA analysis where they actually talked about weather balloons, and I didn't realize that weather balloons are going up
really high.
and down every day.
Yeah.
So it's not that they just go up. They go up and then they come back down again to deliver the data.
Yeah.
And then they are sent up and they come back down.
And they're kind of funny looking.
And exactly. And so having something like this maybe malfunction in a farmer's field is not completely an extraordinary idea. It's
No,
actually,
although it wasn't what it was.
definitely wasn't. And that's interesting, right? That the U.S. government is now lying or misrepresenting what they had found, which of course, well, I'll let you tell the story because I know that this has consequences later on.
Right from Jump Street, we have lies.
Right.
And the reason that there's lies, people assume, oh, it's got to be extraterrestrial if the government's lying. Often the government is lying because it's a top secret government project, which is likely the case for Roswell. Because there was the Mogul balloon project that was happening at that time in that area.
Yeah.
These were big, strange balloons that were designed to spy on Soviet nuclear test attempts. And they were made out of foil and bits of wood and some rubber and some tape.
Yeah. And they would fly incredibly high, but of course, sometimes they would malfunction. And I think this was also what might have been behind what Captain Mantell saw when he went up.
Well, that was Skyhook. It was a different balloon
Oh,
project.
right. Okay. Mogul versus Skyhook.
So after that press conference, the Roswell incident kind of simmers down a bit because back then, people, mistakenly, I would say, trusted the government.
Yeah.
And so the government says, nothing to see here. And the people said, oh, I guess there's nothing to see here.
No.
But, so Captain Ruppelt, who was, of course, the head of Project Blue Book, which was looking into flying saucers at the time,
Yeah.
in his book, he doesn't even really go into Roswell. The ones he goes into are the Kenneth Arnold incident, the Maury Island incident, which we did an episode on, the Mantell incident, which, of course, we've done a ton of episodes on, and the Gorman dogfight, which we've also done a video on. But the Roswell thing, it wasn't really on the radar. It wasn't until the 70s, 1978, when Major Marcel from that photograph starts giving interviews to the National Enquirer
Yeah.
and ufologists claiming that there had been a cover-up and that the material was extraterrestrial.
Right.
And so that's the thing about Roswell you need to know. Roswell happens in the late 40s, but doesn't become a UFO thing really until the late 70s.
Yeah. And then isn't there a book, I think it's published in 82, The Incident at Roswell?
Yep, which is hugely influential.
And that really kind of crystallizes this mythology that what had happened was it was an extraterrestrial craft.
Yeah. So there was a crash and there were alien bodies in that crash. And so, yeah, so stories start to circulate about how there had been this extraterrestrial tech recovered from the site, reverse engineered by the government, and how alien bodies have been recovered. And the claims made by Grush at that hearing in 23 are very similar to the claims made in the late 70s about Roswell.
Yeah.
And so there could be a bunch of reasons for that. Maybe one of the reasons is the stuff about Roswell is true. And so the stories that Grush are telling are just the true stories about what happened to Roswell. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that that story that is told about Roswell enters into mythology and lore. And because, again, Grush didn't say that he saw any of these things, he just heard the stories, he's just hearing stories that were made up about Roswell.
Yeah. And it's funny you put it that way, because when I was listening to Grush's testimony, I felt like this is the X-Files now turned into real life, because he very much struck the image of this kind of Agent Mulder, somebody from the inside who had secret information. And of course, as we said at the beginning of the podcast, X-Files starts with Roswell. And Roswell, by the late 80s, early 90s, has already been built up into this myth. So you're right. It has entered into popular culture. And I wonder, of course, we can't run this experiment, but if we had asked somebody just to recount the kind of UFO crash scenario without having seen the X-Files or necessarily knowing about Roswell, I think they probably would have given us that as a response.
Yeah, this is the story.
Yeah, it's the template, yeah.
But that story doesn't start at Roswell.
Aha.
The story starts after the 47 Roswell incident, but long before the story gets attached to that incident.
I see. So there's a separate incident that is actually more like the Roswell incident than the original Roswell incident.
Exactly. And the easiest way, because that sentence was a disaster.
Which I realized as I was speaking
as you were saying, but it was too late. You were already into that sentence. There was no getting back out of that sentence. But don't worry, because the easiest way to get into this complicated story is to probably go through the same door that everyone else went through with this story. I'm going to start with the publication in 1950 of a book made by journalist Frank Scully titled Behind the Flying Saucers.
Now, Frank Scully is a big ufologist.
He turned into one, but he didn't start out as one, because his previous books before the Flying Saucer book were all written for bedridden people, and they had titles like Fun in Bed, The Convalescent's Handbook.
Really?
More Fun in Bed, The Convalescent's Handbook. Bedside Manna, the third Fun in Bed book, and Just What the Doctor Ordered, Fun in Bed.
Huh.
Now, when he says fun in bed, what he's referring to is you're so sick you can't get out of bed.
Right.
And so it's like little puzzles and crosswords and stuff.
Right.
That's what he was writing before this.
Interesting.
And so Behind the Flying Saucers was a bit of a switch in both form and content for Scully.
A little.
So it opens with a brief essay about the poor state of things regarding the American government's reaction to the flying saucer situation, which is understandable. This is 1950s. This is hot on the heels of the birth of the modern flying saucer movement. Again, we said Kenneth Arnold, Maury Island, Captain Mantell, Major Donald Kehoe, super influential, had written his article, The Flying Saucers Are Real, which had been very critical of the U.S. government covering up the truth about the extraterrestrial origins of flying saucers. And so this is all out there. This is all in the mix at this point in 1950. And it's hot. It's in a hot mix.
Okay.
And Kehoe, who we just mentioned, like, what do you think of Kehoe?
I think he's an honest man. So we have mentioned him in the podcast in the past. He comes from the U.S. Air Force, I think.
Navy flyer.
Sorry, forget. But he is an insider from the U.S.
Military,
exactly. And is a believer in flying saucers. But he wants the U.S. government to take the possibility of extraterrestrials seriously. And he actually wants to, I think he had developed a design for like a landing station, like a kind of a welcoming place for them, to invite them to say, we're friendly and we'd love to talk. So I think he is an honest investigator. I don't think he's a scammer. I think he believes in extraterrestrials. So, yeah.
And you bring up a good point. You said he's not a scammer. Because here's the thing. When you enter into this world of flying saucers and UFOs, you encounter a bunch of different kinds of characters.
Yeah, and we have the scammers.
Yeah, there are scammers.
Yeah.
There are the people who are scammed. Mm-hmm. There are people who are scammers.
Yep.
There are hoaxers.
Yep.
There are true believers.
Yep.
There are skeptical inquirers. All of these people are in
And
this...
often what makes it so complicated is either people change from one to another, or they're a mix of both sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Hynek from Blue Book starts off as a hardcore skeptic and becomes a true believer,
Becomes a true believer.
but not a scammer.
No.
This story is going to have a bunch of different kinds of characters in it.
Okay.
But here's a little heads up. A lot of scammers.
Okay. But not Kehoe. So
No.
now where had we left it with Kehoe?
So, back to this book.
Yes.
Scully, Frank Scully.
Frank Scully.
So he really goes to town in this opening chapter,
Okay.
similar to Donald Kehoe, talking about, hey, the American government is not giving us the full truth on this. They're concealing stuff. This is our business. We should know.
Right.
And basically almost goes to the point of calling the American government despicable for concealing all of this information
Okay.
from the people. And then the book moves on to the heart of the matter with a description of a shocking guest lecture
Okay.
at the University of Denver from somebody initially referred to in the book as Scientist X.
Oh.
And so this lecture really did occur.
Okay.
This did happen because aside from Scully's book's description of it, there's other independent sources that reported on it. Mm-hmm. And they're more or less in agreement with what Scully said happened. And what Scientist X, this guest lecturer at this university, was going to say was going to stun the world.
Okay.
Because what he said was there had been 3 crashed flying saucers.
Oh, okay.
There had been a 4th flying saucer, which landed but didn't crash and was able to take off again.
Okay.
They had originated from Venus.
Ah.
They used the power of magnetism to travel at the speed of light.
Okay.
The 3 crash saucers had been recovered by the American government. Scientists were able to reverse engineer some of the tech on those saucers. And there had been several dozen dead aliens in the saucers.
All right.
There had been many such visits like these, and interactions with the Venusian flying saucers had gone back for several years. And the government was covering the whole thing up. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is, you can imagine being at that guest lecture.
Yeah.
It would be kaboom. So according to Scully, who wasn't at the talk himself, the effect this had on the crowd was extraordinary, as you would expect. Scientist X had clearly a profound understanding of high-level physics and biology. Like, this guy knew his stuff,
Okay.
this Scientist X. In fact, the equations, according to Scully in his book, the equations that Scientist X scrawled on a blackboard during the talk, those equations were immediately lacquered over to protect them for posterity so that those chalk marks would be could remain.
Yeah.
Because chalk, famously, easy to erase. Right? Not this chalk. This chalk is too important and too scientific and amazing.
Okay.
And the crowd was largely won over by the claims of Scientist X, referred to in the book as startling, sensational, spellbinding, electrifying, like our lectures.
Yeah.
And then after the lecture, as we also are, Scientist X was whisked away
Okay.
before anybody could find out who he really was.
Okay.
The government was furious about this. They're
Yeah.
like, give us Scientist X. This guy is a threat to national security. This guy knows too much.
Right. Now, this is all in Scully's book,
This
in
is all
his
in Scully's
first
book.
chapter.
In the first couple chapters. It's all in the book. And as I said, the talk did happen.
Okay.
Right? So the government, trying to find out who Scientist X was, they grilled the guy who had brought him. Now, the guy who had brought him was a man named George Kohler, described by Scully as a former pro football player for the Chicago Bears and also an ad man for a local radio station.
Okay.
And Kohler just refused to give it up. This guy, I mean, he's a pro football player. He's tough. He's not going to give up to the government who Scientist X was. So let's get into the specifics, as described in Scully's book. In 1948, about 500 miles outside of Denver, the first flying saucer crashed and was recovered by authorities who had detected it on early warning radar, the sort of thing to detect Soviet bombers. Mm-hmm. It was saucer-shaped, which I know you're going to want to talk about, but we'll come back to it.
Okay.
And it was exactly 99.99 feet in diameter.
Uh-huh.
Very specific number.
Right. Because clearly...
Blah, 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 blah. I know. We'll get to it.
Okay.
So the cabin inside, exactly 72 inches in height.
Uh-huh.
Exactly. 72 inches.
Okay.
There were 16 men found inside, all dead, between 35 and 40 years old. They all had light-colored skin, They looked exactly like humans, but were smaller than us.
Okay.
Probably about 40 inches tall. None had beards. Some had peach fuzz. There was food found on board that was similar to ours, but the aliens drank heavy water.
Okay.
Heavy water is water in which there's a higher percentage of the hydrogen atom of deuterium.
Yeah, I guess so. I need Shelley for this.
I can hear her shaking her head at us
Yeah,
right now.
I know.
Oh, dear. In deuterium, as far as I
Oh,
know,
no.
I'm going to press on.
Come back.
It's ill-conceived, but I'm pressing on. I believe it's a hydrogen atom with a neutron,
Yeah.
which makes it like literally heavier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so they all appeared to have been burned by a great heat, all of the alien bodies on this thing. Possibly caused because they also found a small hole in one of the portholes.
I see.
And I mean, that would explain it, because according to scientist X, if the ship was traveling through the atmosphere at the speed of light, like 186,000 miles per second, that would explain how the air resistance could have burned their bodies, because that's quite the breeze.
Yeah. I mean, that breeze is going at the speed of light.
Yeah.
One wonders if it would even interact with physical beings.
We'll come back to that too.
Yeah, okay.
Lee is chomping at the bit. Champing at the bit, I think, is actually the phrase.
Is it really?
Yeah, you'd think it'd be chomping, but I think it's champing.
Huh.
Yeah. Okay, so the second ship was found crashed near an Army proving ground, which was useful, and looked similar to the first, only it was 72 feet in diameter, not 99.99. Still all divisible by nines, though. It also contained 16 dead men, although in this case the bodies weren't burned. Perhaps they had suffered some kind of illness from interaction with Earth's atmosphere or something.
Okay.
The third ship landed near Phoenix and was 36 feet in diameter, still nines, and only contained 2 of the small humans. Now, they landed safely but died while trying to exit their craft. Again, possibly due to something in the atmosphere.
Okay.
This third ship also differed from the first 2 in size, number, and crew, and also not having a toilet on board.
Oh, the other ones had a
The
toilet
other ones
on
had
board.
toilets. This one didn't have a toilet.
That is interesting.
So it's like a short-range little scout.
I have never considered what an alien toilet would look like.
And now it's literally the only thing you can think about.
No, that is now consuming me for the rest of this episode.
Well, these guys just look like little tiny people.
Right.
I'm assuming a little tiny toilet.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Cute.
There was a 4th saucer located, but it landed safely, and before the Army could capture it, the several small aliens who were flying it hopped into it, flew away. And they didn't so much fly away as like instantly disappear, because they flew away at the speed of light.
Oh, of course.
And so it just looks like it vanishes.
It would indeed.
Now, based on the controls and the mechanisms, again, this is all based on what Scully is saying about what scientist X was saying at this talk.
Which he didn't go to.
Which he didn't go to, but he'd read about, and it did happen.
Right.
So based on the controls and mechanisms in the saucer, it used magnetism for transportation. And this cleared up a bit of a mystery,
Okay.
because it also appeared that it might use magnetism for defense. It didn't have like rifles, it didn't have machine guns, it didn't have cannons, but it did have the capacity to demagnetize a target. And so scientist X said, this discovery clears up a previous mystery, the Captain Mantell incident.
Oh, I see.
Because 1948, fighter pilot Captain Mantell, what happens?
Well, he and two other pilots are scrambled to intercept something over the skies of Kentucky. It is big. It's seen by many people.
And again, this is something that 100% did happen.
100% did happen. It is potentially a national security threat. We don't know what it is that's there in the sky. 2 out of the 3 pilots can't make it up there. It's too high. Mantell, though, pursues and keeps going and radios back what he is seeing, but then radio contact is lost and he crashes and dies.
Yeah. And it's been said that his last communication was still climbing. It's metallic and of a tremendous size.
Yes.
Referring to this UFO.
Yes. And I think he mentioned that it was windowless. Like, it certainly seemed alien, or it seemed bizarre.
I mean, bizarre enough that people were calling the cops on this thing.
Yeah.
And seeing it in the sky for quite a while.
Yeah.
Right. So, obviously, people demanded an official explanation. We have
That's
a
right.
crashed plane. We have a dead pilot.
Yeah, and apparently he was chasing Venus.
Right.
That was the official explanation.
That's the official explanation
it's
from the
like
Air Force.
It's like the weather balloon explanation in that it actually can just generate more curiosity and skepticism.
Especially when it's clearly a lie and a cover-up.
Yes.
In the fact that Venus wouldn't have been visible and wouldn't have been in that part of the sky at that time of day, at that time of year.
And that's in Project Blue Book with Hynek. Hynek does those calculations, and he actually looks to see where Venus is.
Yeah, so wait a second. It couldn't have been Venus.
Yeah.
Also, everyone was saying that it was huge and teardrop-shaped.
Yes.
Which Venus is not.
And thousands of people saw it.
And
like
thousands
not
of
just
people.
like one or two.
So the argument here, made by Scientist X, is that that was one of these Venusian flying saucers.
And the magnetism sort of like interfered with his machinery.
Well,
and it just
Mantell
cut
got
out.
too close to it.
Yeah.
And the aliens just demagnetized his plane, which basically disintegrated it.
Okay.
So the controls in this craft, according to Scientist X, extremely high-tech. The entire thing was controlled with a panel of push buttons.
Okay.
Can you imagine?
It's amazing.
What convenience.
Yes.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Push button convenience at your fingertips, at your tiny little fingertips. And speaking of buttons, the crew were all wearing uniforms, and the thread that held their buttons on the uniforms was so strong, it could support 450 pounds of weight before snapping.
Wow.
That's strong thread.
That'd be pretty cool.
They are more advanced than us. And Scientist X was able to collect a few pieces of the machinery from the saucers, several small discs that they resisted any attempts to damage them or mark them, despite using immense heat or acid or diamond drills. Like, you couldn't affect these little discs.
Amazing.
But he was able to get a handful of them and take off with them. That's the story from Scientist X.
Okay.
Now let's talk about that story.
Yes.
Because I know there are many aspects of it
Yes.
that I know you were unhappy with.
Okay.
Okay. And here's, I think, one of the main things I get from this story. Typical of early alien and UFO encounter stories, there seems to be a limitation of imagination involved.
Yeah.
Like, here's a story. We've studied so many stories of alien interaction, like the contactee movement. And what strikes you about the contactee movement of the 50s, about the alien stories that they tell?
Well, I mean, it's remarkable how different they are from the way that story has evolved. So the aliens are humans.
Yeah, they're just people.
They're just people. If anything is different about them, it's their outfit is a little kind of like...
They got like a onesie on.
Yeah, like a kind of a Norwegian ski suit, kind of metallic. But they're just human beings.
Talking English.
Speaking in English.
Using like 1950s slang.
Yes.
Like, hey, buddy, we're from Venus.
Yeah, and exactly. And that was the other thing. They come from Venus,
Yep.
which is awfully close.
Yep.
Since our astronomical devices, telescopes and things like that have gotten better, the alien origin point has been
We've moved
pushed
further
much
away.
further away.
Yep.
Now it tends to be things like Alpha Centauri
Yep.
and there are others. So,
And the other thing about all these stories is that they're so comprehensible.
yes.
Like, here's an alien encounter that I would find more believable. If somebody said, hey, I had an alien encounter and here's what happened, and they said, I didn't understand any of it,
Right.
and the whole thing was completely incomprehensible, and I can't even describe it, and it was so strange and weird,
Yes.
I'd be like, okay, that sounds like an alien encounter.
Yeah.
Not, I met a guy at a diner,
Right.
and we had waffles.
And he told me about the nuclear bomb being dangerous.
Yeah, that is not to me an alien story. Just coming back and being like, I don't know how to describe this. I don't know what I was seeing.
Now,
That seems like an alien encounter.
it's an interesting point you raise about the sort of, I guess, I don't know if you put it this way as a lack of imagination, but certainly we imagine the future very much with the tools that we have in the present. And you can see that throughout sort of the evolution also of science fiction, which is self-evidently and self-referentially fiction. It's not pretending to be anything else. But if you read the Jules Verne stuff, you're dealing with technology that looks like the technology or slightly futuristically imagined technology of the day.
And so these aliens are basically just humans of the day, and then they're tweaked a little.
Yeah.
And so when I encounter the tweaked human alien, I find it less believable. And we're given, in this story, we're given aliens that look just like humans except a little smaller. So we're meant to believe that on Venus, a planet that we'll talk about, because
Okay.
Venus is a problem.
Yes.
On Venus, a creature evolved that ended up looking exactly like us.
Yeah.
Except only like 3/4 sized.
Right.
And they wear uniforms with buttons and thread. Like the
Right.
thread is super strong, but they're
Because-
still like sewing buttons on.
Right, and they of course have a kind of hierarchical military structure, just
Like
like
we do.
like they even just like the United States does.
Yeah.
Right, it's like this is how the United States would send out an exploratory ship into space. It would probably be funded by the military-industrial complex. It would be staffed by probably military people.
Yep.
It would be in a
All men.
all men hierarchical structure.
All white guys.
They'd wear uniforms
Yep.
and they'd sew on buttons.
But the thread is so strong. And so also the push button controls.
I love it. I love it. I mean,
I could tell you wanted to say something about the push button controls.
well, again, I mean, it's imagining the future in terms of the kind of things that you have available
What seems
to you.
futuristic to us in 1950? Push buttons.
Right.
My God, to go into like a laundromat and just push a button.
Just to push a button.
Amazing.
Yeah. And
But from our position in 2025, do push buttons seem
no, it's
futuristic?
hopelessly antiquated.
Yeah. Now we would probably say, oh, there was some sort of touch screen.
Yeah,
Or there was
exactly.
some kind of like three-dimensional like hologram that you could interact with.
Exactly.
Things that would have been unimaginable to somebody in the 1950s.
Yes, but imaginable to us now because we've gotten halfway there already. I mean, we do have augmented reality in which that kind of a space can be created in which I interact virtually with things that look like they're out in the world, but they're not really. And it'd be a cool way to actually have a computer or computer controls. Because sometimes I am actually really annoyed with my touchscreen stuff, which my fingers are too fat to text properly.
And you can hold them up to the camera now. People can see them.
That was some great audio podcasting
Yeah.
right there. And I kind of wish that some things were a bit more analog than they are, a bit more actually tactile than they are. So, maybe those push buttons
it'll come
are
back.
actually exactly.
Maybe
It's
the
still-
aliens are saying, hey, all that hologram stuff was trash. Push buttons were where it was at.
Exactly. That was a dead end.
Okay. All right, that's fine. Even though it sounds hilariously retro to us now, this push button idea. But there was something else that you wanted to talk about. I could see it in your eyes.
Yeah, I've forgotten now.
When I said-
the numbers.
When I said that the three saucers were exactly 99.99 feet
Yep.
and 72 feet
Yep.
and 36 feet in diameter.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And scientist X argued that that was super significant because
Yes.
it showed that the aliens had a distinct preference for measurements divisible by 9.
Yes.
But your issue with it was what?
That they are using feet.
Yeah.
Because it only works if you do it in feet. And what is the likelihood that even if there were Venusians out there, and even if they looked exactly like us, just slightly smaller, that they would have adopted the Anglo-American
Yeah, not even the
standard-
metric system.
Not even the metric system, which is actually just as arbitrary
Yeah,
in terms
but at
of
least
its
more rational.
It's more rational in how it builds it up, but the initial unit is still an arbitrary length.
Yeah, there's just some length of rod somewhere that somebody said, this is a meter.
This is a meter.
Why is this a meter? Because I said it's a meter.
'Cause it is.
Because something has to be.
Because something has to work. Because it used to use foot actually referred to feet, and that different people have different size feet. So
Right.
how
In
many?
fact, the Venusians in this story have much smaller feet.
Right. Hey, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't even work internally to the logic.
Yeah.
But it only works if that's so bizarre.
And it's this sort of tiny detail that if you're making up a story, that's what you're going to screw up.
Yeah, that's
You're not
right.
going to think to yourself, wait, why would the aliens be using imperial measurements?
That's a good point because we noticed that same mistake crop up when people were forging documents.
Yep.
It's the little stuff that you don't really think about, like does the State Department use this abbreviation or that abbreviation? Well, today they use this, but they used to use that. You don't know necessarily, and so yeah,
It's easy to screw that stuff
the
up.
devil is in the details.
And
It
you're
really
trying
is.
to be super detailed to make the story seem more realistic, but
Yeah.
then actually people were like, wait, feet and inches.
Also, quite apart from the kind of numerological supposition that it would be meaningful even if everything else were true.
Right.
Like, so what? You can divide it by 9.
The lack of imagination, which you also wanted to talk about, and again, I admire your restraint because I was
Well, I was very much disciplined,
Yes.
so I've been holding back.
for a change. Lack of imagination is also a problem in the shape of the craft. Why?
There's a couple of things I struggle with here. So first of all, we have visited the actual attempt at building a flying saucer.
Yeah.
It is not an aerodynamic craft.
No, unless it's a frisbee and it's spinning
And
really
it's spinning,
quickly.
and you yourself in it are spinning.
Yeah.
Now, of course, that might not matter if you are mostly flying in outer space, where aerodynamics is meaningless because there is no aero. There's no air, so it doesn't matter. Okay, fine. But still, it's a weird shape. The other thing is about the size. It just always strikes me as bizarre that these craft are so small. Even if the inhabitants are, say, half the size of a regular human, or even a quarter of the size, it's still a very small craft to be spending a lot of time in.
It has a toilet. Some of them did.
Of course, there's also the question of now the pattern has been imprinted on popular culture that the alien craft is a flying saucer.
Which comes from Kenneth Arnold,
or the reporter who reported on Kenneth Arnold.
Right, because Arnold didn't say they were saucers. He said they were boomerangs or bats, but the reporter called them flying saucers. And then the whole flying saucer thing that came afterwards was because of that mistake made by the reporter.
Yeah, and then
here we see it again.
Exactly. And then it gets amplified shortly after with all the movies that start coming out in the early 50s, which then depict the alien encounter, invasion, contact as somebody stepping out of a flying saucer.
So again, a bit of a lack of imagination in this story. Now, as far as magnetism as transportation or propulsion, the Canadian government was actually super curious about this in the 50s, about whether flying saucers were powered by magnetism, possibly because of this story.
Okay.
And there was a government project titled Project Magnet, imaginatively,
okay,
that was looking into this. And I've actually been harassing and hassling the Canadian government for years, demanding information on this. And they're being uncharacteristically stubborn about it.
Why, I wonder?
I don't know, but I'm going to keep looking into it.
But there are like magnetic trains, right?
Yeah. Oh, no, it makes
like
some
it's a
sense.
thing. You can do it. The high-speed trains, I think the high-speed trains in Japan function on this magnetic principle.
Well, because to the degree that it reduces resistance.
Yeah, like you're not actually touching the track.
Yeah. So magnetism, yeah, maybe. But let's go back to the burned bodies.
Okay.
They were a bit burned because they were traveling through the atmosphere at the speed of light, and there was a small hole in one of the portholes.
Yeah.
And that caused, because of the wind resistance, caused their bodies to be burned. What would actually happen if something the size of a small airplane tore through our atmosphere at the speed of light? I have an answer.
Okay, well, can I guess?
You can guess.
I would say nothing. I would say it would go through matter because it itself is no longer matter. If you're traveling at the speed of light, that's the problem. I mean,
you'd be infinitely weighty. You'd have infinite mass.
Don't you turn, or isn't that the barrier to getting to the speed of light?
Well, the barrier is you keep adding more energy into that thing to try to make it go faster, and that energy turns into mass.
So first of all, sorry, Shelley, and all physicists and people who know math and science, as we too struggle through this. So
hey, I think I've got it right.
Well, I know, but I think that's why you can't get to light speed.
Yeah.
But if you were at light speed,
pumping in energy, but you're just getting heavier and heavier.
If you were at light speed, you would no longer be mass. I think you turn into energy.
Huh. Well, here's what I put together what would happen. I mean, air is thick.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't seem like it's thick, but it's like really thick.
Yeah, I mean, you can feel it at 100 kilometers an hour on the highway. You put your hand out the window.
And this is why the SR-71 had to be built in such a very specific and ridiculous fashion. Because that was a spy plane that punched through the air 3 times the speed of sound.
Yes.
And like that came close to melting it or tearing it to pieces through air resistance. And this is a considerable understatement, maybe one of the greatest understatements of all time. But the speed of light is much higher than 3 times the speed of sound.
It is
much
higher.
Right.
I mean, we can't get fractionally to the speed of light.
Not even
we can't do 1% of the speed of light.
No, except if we turn on a flashlight.
Well, humanly built objects cannot be accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light.
True.
Like a meaningful fraction, like 1%, 5%.
I like how very specific we're being because we're so far out of our depth here.
Yeah.
I'm about to get further out of my depth because I'm about to describe what would happen if a vehicle traveled through the atmosphere at the speed of light.
Okay.
So the saucer would have to almost instantly compress the air it was moving through.
Okay.
Like almost instantly, to an almost impossible degree, causing a shock wave that would be the equivalent of several nuclear explosions all the way along its flight path.
That's kind of cool.
Oh, it's amazing.
I mean, it's super destructive, but...
Oh, no, it would wreck some stuff.
This would be a good sci-fi entry of the aliens.
Instant nukes through the sky. Because the air is made of particles, the resulting collisions between the saucer and those particles would release gamma rays and other high-energy particles and turn the air into like superheated plasma.
Wow.
This would heat up the Earth's atmosphere probably to a catastrophic degree and lead us to say the saucer would be completely annihilated.
Yes. Unless we are dealing with material science that we simply don't know. Like maybe there is...
So then a lot's going to hinge on those disks.
Right.
That Scientist X apparently has.
Yes.
So we'll have to try to get our hands on those and test them.
Yes.
As far as Mantell goes, that was part of the Scientist X talk. That UFO was seen by a bunch of people. Did it look like a saucer to them?
No.
And as we said, that was almost certainly a skyhook balloon, another secret government project. And Mantell's plane wasn't disintegrated, it crashed. We've seen the photographs of it. Now let's talk about Venus, where these things are supposedly from, according to Scientist X. So in the 1950s, a lot of attention was paid to Venus as the origin for flying saucers.
Okay.
Makes sense. It's the closest planet to Earth, sort of Earth-sized.
Yep.
And it's right there. It's our
right
closest
there.
neighbor.
You'll often see it in the night sky.
Yeah, it's pretty. A lot of the contactees, like George Adamski, claimed that the aliens they were meeting at diners were from Venus.
Now, Adamski is a scammer.
Adamski is a scammer. However, Venus sucks.
Yeah.
Like, it's just the worst.
Well, I mean, again, we haven't actually, as far as we know, encountered life outside of our planet. So we need to go with a couple of basic assumptions, right?
That life as we understand it,
exactly.
Venus sucks.
Life as we understand it requires a certain set of conditions. And astronomers who are dealing with this, they're looking for exoplanets that are habitable. They call it the Goldilocks zone. It can't be too hot, can't be too cold. It can't be there can't be too much gravity.
Or not enough.
There needs to be water, probably.
This is for carbon-based life as we understand it.
Exactly.
Right.
And again, because
But if they look like little people,
right,
then they're carbon-based life.
Probably.
Yeah.
But even if you're going to be something very similar, like, so again, sorry, Shelley and all physicists who know what they're talking about, and they're going to be looking for an atom that has roughly about the same amount of opportunities to form bonds as carbon. So I think silicone is going to be close.
Yeah, that's the second best one as far as I know.
And yet we don't have any evidence on Earth of silicone-based life.
It's certainly possible.
It's maybe possible. So, we have to work within a certain set of parameters. Otherwise, we might imagine that life is the constellation of many thousands or millions of planets that are together, and that somehow is life on another order. I mean, it gets unwieldy. So we look for things that are very similar, and in those conditions, Venus is impossible.
Yeah.
It rains acid.
Yeah, thickest atmosphere in our solar system, 93 times thicker than Earth's. If you stood on the surface, you'd get crushed.
That's the
pulped immediately because of the pressure.
Yeah.
Because of the thick carbon dioxide atmosphere, despite Mercury being closer to the sun, Venus is the hottest.
It is the hottest planet in our solar system.
406 degrees Celsius, approximately 406, or 860 degrees Fahrenheit for our alien Venusian friends who
who only use the Americans.
In the 1960s, the Soviets got obsessed with trying to put a probe on Venus.
And they did.
But they kept melting.
Yeah,
kept firing off probes, and they just kept melting.
Yeah,
it was the most Soviet thing.
Yeah, it's amazing, though, because I think that is the only images that we have from the surface of Venus come from these Soviet probes that lasted like a second, and then completely disintegrated.
Yeah.
Because, it's intense pressure, intense heat, and then what is it like? Sulfuric acid, isn't that the rain?
Rains from the sky.
It's rain sulfuric acid.
No, it sucks there. Unless that's what you're into, in which case, bully for you.
You do you.
Yeah,
but
I don't want to yuck anybody's yum, planet-wise.
But also, I mean, from, say, those pictures, we, again, have no evidence of...
Doesn't look like there's much of a civilization there.
No.
So there's clearly some issues with this story. So we need to look at the person behind the story.
Yeah, okay. This is Scully.
Scientist X.
Oh, Scientist X.
Yeah, Scully we know. He's a guy who tells you what to do when you're stuck in bed. But Scientist X, the mysterious Scientist X, we're going to have to work really, really hard to figure out who Scientist X is.
Okay.
or we just read the next chapter in the book in which Scully says who Scientist X is. I
Who
don't know
is
why
Scientist
there was
X?
all of the mystery in the first chapter.
Right.
Scully explains in the first third of the book that Scientist X is an oil man named Silas Newton.
Okay.
Described by Scully as a bigwig in the energy industry who was famous for being able to find oil in places that other people had given up on.
Mm-hmm.
But why had this oil man gotten all this info on flying saucers? Because of his work using magnetism to detect oil, Newton had gotten in touch with another scientist that Scully only refers to as Dr. G.
Okay. Now, does Dr. G get revealed in the next
No.
No, okay.
Dr. G stays secret the whole time.
Okay.
Whereas Scientist X
Is
gets
revealed
blown immediately.
Okay.
And so, yeah, unlike Scientist X, Scully keeps Dr. G a secret. And Dr. G had apparently been the one who was working on the crashed alien saucers with the government.
Okay.
And brought Newton in because Newton was just such an expert in magnetism. So that's how this all happened. So Scully does claim to have met Dr. G in person and interviewed him about the flying saucers. And Dr. G had apparently been part of the team that examined both the tech of the saucer and the biology of the alien corpses. And again, I would think that those would be two different scientists that would do that.
Well, exactly.
You'd have a biologist and then a physicist.
Sure.
Or, an engineer, but not the same person doing both of those things.
I feel like you probably want teams.
Probably a big team of people.
I mean, this is too much for one person.
Yeah.
Like, how are you even in material sciences? How are you? You'd need experts in metallurgy.
Yep.
You'd need experts in, I don't know what other kind of subfields there are.
You did
here.
well with metallurgy, and then you should have just said etc.
But yeah, etc. There we go.
There we go.
The magic of editing.
Yes. So it was Dr. G who had also said it was Venus that they came from. So to get to Dr. G, let's start with this Silas Newton oil man guy. What do we know about him? And then maybe through that, we can get to G.
Okay.
And we can.
Okay.
Thanks to the thing that I'm always the most thankful for. Whenever we do any of these from like the 1950s or the 60s or whenever, the one thing that I'm always the most thankful for, the thing that makes our lives much, much easier, is somebody had done some good journalism at the time. Mm-hmm. Like, how much do you love that?
It really is so... They do the Lord's work in a way. It really is the kind of... the candle in the wind. I don't know how to put it. I'm getting
candle in the wind. I
Well,
don't think that's the right metaphor
no,
at all.
but it
a
is,
candle in the wind would blow out.
Well, no, but it's you protect it.
That's
and it's
Princess
like,
Diana
it is,
and Marilyn
well,
Monroe.
It's exactly. Okay, fine, but it's the beacon of shining light in this otherwise dark and bleak.
It's the
mess.
green light at the end of Daisy's Dock.
Don't know the reference.
Oh, okay. It's a book.
I am thankful for good journalism.
Yes.
Let's put it like that.
All right.
And I've relied on it often in this podcast.
And there's some great journalism in this one. A reporter from Fate magazine. Fate magazine was a magazine that was very pro flying saucer.
It's a UFO magazine, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like UFO sort of Fortean kind of weird stuff that was going on, like cryptids, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But this guy's about to do some good journalism.
Okay.
J.P. Kahn is his name.
How do you spell that last name?
C-A-H-N.
Thank you.
And he had read Scully's book and thought, this is weird. I got to get to the bottom of this.
Okay.
So he decides to get to the bottom of it. So Kahn starts, reasonably enough, by interviewing Scully to try to get more information about this elusive Dr. G. But Scully was very reticent to give up any information on G and really to give up any more details other than what was in the book. And so Kahn said, basically, Scully just recited the book to me.
Okay.
No new information.
Right, okay.
So then Kahn went to contacts in the oil industry. Mm-hmm. See, good journalism. Because if Silas Newton, this oil man, this Scientist X, was such a bigwig, everyone's going to know about him. Nobody had heard of him.
Yeah, okay.
To the point where Kahn started to wonder if Scully had made up Newton
Yes.
and Dr. G.
Okay.
They were just fictional people. But Scully's wife, Mrs. Scully, had told Kahn that she had met both of them.
Oh.
And Kahn said, I trust her. She
Okay.
seems like a straight shooter.
So she's not in on the scam.
She doesn't seem in on anything.
Okay.
Like, I don't think she's lying to me. So that's enough to make him think, no, these guys are real.
Okay. Well, if you trust the journalist and he trusts her, then I guess...
By the transitive property of trust.
Exactly. I also
And
trust.
also because I know how the story ends.
Yeah, okay.
So, but then Scully offers to introduce Kahn to Newton.
Interesting.
I mean, what better
That's
way
a
to
twist.
prove somebody
That's
exists?
actually a twist now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So at the meeting, which happened, Newton shows up and he produces some of the little alien discs
Oh.
in a little handkerchief. And Kahn is allowed to touch them and hold them. And he's like, oh, these are pretty weirdly light and strong. this is kind of strange.
Also weird, though, that this person gets to keep this stuff if he is working.
Well, I get the feeling that he snuck it out.
No, I see.
And they're just little bits of disc.
So he's actually kind of stolen it from the government.
That's sort of what's implied there.
All right, fine.
Now, Kahn wasn't too impressed with Newton, despite the fact that Newton produced these discs, and so he does some investigating into that original talk that so-called scientist X gave at the University of Denver. So Kahn meets with Thor Severson, who was a reporter for the Denver Post, who had been at the talk, because like I keep saying, the talk happened, and got some background details. So Newton had been invited to speak by a grad student named Francis Broman, who had invited Newton as a kind of test for his students, because he had been talking about the scientific method.
Oh,
and so
cool.
he brings in Newton with his claims to see if his students could accurately evaluate the scientific claims made by a presenter.
Nice.
So he doesn't bring him in because he thinks this guy's got important stuff to say. He brings him in thinking, this guy's got some nonsense. I want to see if my students can detect that nonsense.
Now, can I just pause and ask you what you think about this as a pedagogical technique?
I'm nervous about it.
Okay. Because I like it in some
cool.
sense as well, because you're actually testing it out in real life. Like, can you figure out what is truth and not? But on the other hand, I feel like this kind of got away from everybody.
It particularly got away from Broman. And like there was a bit of a problem with Broman's academic career after this.
Oh, dear.
But again, he meant well. He wanted them to use the scientific method to evaluate Newton's claims. And Broman didn't expect it to become the big deal it became. As for the astounding chalkboard notes that were lacquered over to protect them, I got a quote from Broman. He said, "The lecturer's drawings were not lacquered over. It would have been ridiculous to preserve them. They were just a couple of circles labeled Earth and Venus.
Yeah.
A crude sketch of what the saucers were supposed to have looked like, and a diagram showing how combinations of digits can be added up to total 9, which was supposed to illustrate something to do with the measurements of the saucers."
Uh-huh. Yes, exactly. Something. Okay. Mm-hmm. So not earth-shattering equations that are so complex we need to lacquer
this over
and then kind of go back and figure it out what it might possibly mean.
No. This circle is Earth.
Yes.
This one is Venus.
Okay.
These numbers add up to 9.
Saucer, yes.
Slow down. Slow down. You're going too fast. Remember how Newton had been escorted to the talk by a radio salesman named Kohler, who Scully described as a former Chicago Bears player?
Yes.
Right. So Kahn contacted the Bears. We've never heard of this guy.
Okay.
Why are you lying about little tiny pointless things like this? But Kohler did exist. He was a radio ad man. And Kohler told Kahn that Kohler had also met with the brilliant Dr. G, who at the time had been using high-tech materials to build fantastically strong arrow shafts for a noted hunter and explorer named Howard Hill.
What is an arrow shaft?
It's like the shaft of an arrow. Like you're shooting like a bow and arrow.
I see. Okay.
So this guy, he knew so much about fantastic materials that he was able to make these amazing arrows for this hunter.
I see. Okay.
And so then Kahn contacted that hunter's manager and said, "Hey, I hear you've got these amazing arrows." And the manager said, "What are you talking about?"
Oh.
Again, why are you lying about these tiny little pointless, ridiculous things?
Why are you lying about tiny little pointless things? I wonder, like, as a real question, I feel like
it makes the story seem more believable when you have all these little touches.
And also no one's going to bother.
Right, except for J.P. Kahn.
Exactly.
He's like, I'm going to look into what you just said about the arrows.
But then nobody cares or nobody listens, right?
Yeah.
Like we've seen this before, that the fictional, hyperbolic, untrue story has a kind of an appeal and attraction, whereas the boring truth is always kind of meandering behind, trying to be like, no, that's not true. That's not true.
Because the truth is always pushing up its glasses and saying, well, actually, and who wants that at the party?
Exactly.
Nobody.
Exactly. And so I think that is why you add all these extraneous details, because it makes it sound more plausible. And also, who in the audience is going to bother contacting the Bears?
A good journalist is.
Exactly.
So then Kahn tracks down Newton's Oil Company, which exists, and is 2 little offices and a waiting room. Mm-hmm. And Kahn then interviewed Richard White, an exploration superintendent for Standard Oil. And White said, "Sure, I remember old Newton. He used to come out to Rangeley with some sort of doodlebug outfit, one of those black boxes with a lot of dials on it nobody ever gets to look inside of. He tried to tell everybody we were way off on the geology. He even picked up some leases down where his doodlebug said the oil was supposed to be and did some drilling. Turned out he was the one that was way off on the geology.
I see. So he wasn't able to discover all this undiscoverable oil that everybody had missed, but he was able. Nope.
But he
Okay.
was trying to sell a doodlebug.
Sure.
And is there a better metaphor for so much of the UFO scams than a doodlebug that nobody's allowed to look inside of?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, come on. That
Well-
metaphor makes itself.
Well, exactly.
So at this point, Khan is very unimpressed with the whole crew. Everyone associated with this story is like, why the lies are so pointless and so petty and so silly. But he wants to get a hold of one of Newton's alleged alien discs, because that's going to be the thing, right? Because then you can have it analyzed. So he met with Newton again. Newton refused to give him one, of course. So Khan comes up with a plan. He had seen and handled the discs a few times.
Okay.
And so he had a number of discs constructed that seemed like in his memory to be about the right weight and shape and color and size as the one Newton had.
Okay.
And then he was going to try the old switcheroo.
Oh, a little palming the real disc and then replacing it with a fake one.
Exactly.
I like it.
Yep.
I mean, unethical, but I like it.
I like it. I'm into it.
He's doing it for truth.
Yeah, that's right. And the ends justify the means. They don't. So Khan has a bunch of these fake discs made, and he gets
Yeah.
a pocket full of jingly discs, and he
Okay.
meets up with Newton again, but Newton refuses to hand over the discs, and so he has to go home with the same jingly fake discs. Then, because he realizes, I'm not good at this stuff, so he sets up another meeting with Newton and brought another man with him. Khan brings another man named Hal McIntyre. Now, Khan said that this Hal McIntyre guy was someone who had also seen a flying saucer.
Okay.
The truth was, Hal McIntyre was a stage magician.
Nice.
Because this was a guy that was going to be able to pull off the old switcheroo
Right.
in like a really subtle way.
Yeah.
Again, doesn't work. Newton doesn't produce the discs.
Wow.
This is getting very... You've gone to the lengths of bringing a magician. That's so frustrating. So in the meantime, Khan is still digging through old newspapers and finding all sorts of stories about Newton being a con man, being charged with fraudulent stock practices. Like I've got here, these will look familiar to you.
With the green light, I can't actually see what I'm looking at. It's got an official seal on it.
Of the FBI.
Okay.
I've got all these FBI documents about Newton dating back to the 30s.
Oh,
even,
wow.
About him trying to pull scams
Okay,
and to like
okay.
rip people off and to claim he can do things that he can't do.
Just out of curiosity, any connection with Adamski and that scene? Like,
No connection with Adamski, but
Okay.
it's like he's a
but he's the
kindred
two
spirit.
peas in a pod, yeah.
Yeah. And also, speaking of being unethical, using some methods that Khan does not explain in his article, I think it probably involved bribing somebody at the phone company.
Okay.
Khan discovers that Newton frequently calls somebody in Phoenix named Leo Gebauer.
Okay.
And according to Scully's book, Dr. G was in Phoenix.
Oh,
And Gebauer was the proprietor of the Western Radio and Engineering Company, so he would have had some engineering expertise. And so Khan decides, you know what, maybe this is Dr. G. This Dr. Gebauer, maybe it's Dr. G, decides to pay him a visit, but before he can set it up, Newton wanted to meet again. And this time, Khan's like, all right, I'm just going to play into his greed. And so Khan tells Newton, listen, I got a guy that'll pay you $35,000 for proof of this story.
nice. Okay.
And that was enough to get Newton to bring out those discs. And Khan had showed up, of course, with a pocket full of his own fake discs.
Okay.
Ready to swap. But when he saw Newton's discs again, his heart plummets in his chest. Because he's like, oh, I got it wrong. Because memory is terrible.
Yes.
And so the discs I made are not even close to the ones that he has.
Okay.
The fakes were clearly too thin. There was only one that was even remotely close, and it was still pretty far off.
Okay.
So we decided, I guess this is my shot. I guess like the thickest disc, it's still pretty thin, but maybe it'll work. And I'll let Khan describe what happened next.
Okay.
Let me see one of those discs again, Mr. Newton, I said. I guess I'm not cut out for this sort of thing because my voice sounded like I was going to be sick. And when I took my hands out of my pocket, I could see the skin crease shine where sweat was forming. I took Newton's disc between my thumb and forefinger, held it up to look at it, and then I let it drop into my cupped hand. I gave a kind of feeble cough with the idea that if it clinked against the fake, the sound would be covered. There wasn't any clink. I went through the motions of hefting the disc in my hand, although actually I was holding the two of them tightly palmed to keep them from getting mixed up. I just sat there for a second or two, hefting away, and trying to look as if I was pondering some deep interplanetary problem. Then, Looking Newton right in the eye, as McIntyre had told me to, I let the fake slide into my other hand, and I passed it back to him.
Wow.
Keeping my eyes from flicking down at that fake disc as I handed it over was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Mm-hmm. But it was a success.
Nice.
Newton didn't notice a switch, and when it was tested at the lab, it was...
Aluminum.
It was aluminum. How did you know it was going to be aluminum?
It was light.
Yeah.
And thin.
Yep. It was aluminum. It was like aircraft gate aluminum.
Yeah,
Yep.
but I mean,
Yep. Yeah.
It's not my first rodeo.
Yeah. Yeah. You've encountered scammers before. It's always aluminum. With the government, it's always
It's weather balloons or Venus.
Yeah. So at this point, Khan goes back to Scully. And he's like, hey, Scully, like about all of the things you said in your book, and just presents all of the evidence that he's gathered.
Yeah.
And he says, listen, this whole thing is a con job. His question at this point is about Scully.
Yeah. Are you in on it or not?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Are you a
sure.
scammer or are you among the scammed?
Scammed. Yeah.
And when Khan presents all this stuff, including the testing that had been done on the discs, he asks him, listen, is Dr. G actually this Leo Gebauer? And Scully admitted, yeah, that's the guy.
Okay.
And so then Khan flies out to meet with Gebauer, but Gebauer admitted nothing about being Dr. G.
Okay.
And so in the end...
Was Gebauer even in on it, or was this?
Oh,
one
no. He was, and we'll come back to that.
This wasn't one of these.
He was the right guy.
Okay.
Because he eventually ends up in jail.
Okay.
For scams.
Okay.
So in the end, Khan comes to the conclusion that Newton and Gebauer were snake oil salesmen.
Yeah.
But that Scully actually had believed their pitch.
Right. Okay.
I mean, Scully was probably a motivated believer because he was going to be able to get a best-selling book out of the story, so he wants it to be true.
Yeah.
But he wasn't a scammer in the way these other two guys were scammers. But Khan couldn't figure out what was the point of this. What was the point of this whole scam? Based on Newton's rep, he had assumed it had something to do with selling some sort of alien-based tech for finding oil through magnetism. Mm-hmm. That he was going to make a claim that, oh, I have access to this top-secret government alien reverse-engineered tech, and
Right.
if you give me a bunch of money, I can then find your oil for you.
Oh.
And this is exactly what it was.
Right.
And this is eventually what got Newton arrested.
Oh, really?
Because he was selling people this gadget that he claimed was made from the stolen tech, and he would sell it for like $50,000, but claim that it actually was worth $850,000.
Wow. Yeah. Sure.
When the authorities got a hold of it, this is probably about $3.50 worth of parts.
Yeah,
of old surplus radio
It's
parts.
a good markup.
It's a doodlebug.
Yeah.
That's why you don't let people look in your doodlebug.
Yeah. Now, when you're telling me about this device to look for oil, it reminded me of Uri Geller, who for a while was using his self-purported psychic abilities to help people look for oil. Now, as far as I know, he wasn't sued, and I don't know if he could be. So is the more clever scam, not to actually build a device?
Yeah, once you have a device that can be tested and examined and taken apart, that's a problem for you.
Right. Whereas maybe it should have been, I have had the encounter with an alien, and now I'm able to see the oil under the ground.
So your advice to scammers is don't make a doodlebug, be the doodlebug.
Yes.
Okay, that's good advice for everybody out there. Don't
I mean, this is the danger.
be the doodlebug you want to make.
This is the danger of the work that we do, is essentially by showing you how not to do it.
That's
It's
right.
implied.
Yeah.
It's like...
You could listen to all of our work and become a really good scammer.
And just invert
We
it.
could become really good scammers.
Well, I know.
Why aren't we becoming really good scammers?
Because there is this weird commitment to ethics and the truth that we have.
Because we're suckers.
Exactly.
But, so now, this ridiculous story with these ridiculous people in it, which is clearly a hoax and
Yes.
clearly fake and clearly a scam, I would argue that the key aspects of this story get forgotten and detached from this Aztec flying saucer crash.
Yeah.
And attached to Roswell.
Right. Because it's effectively...
It's a good story.
Yeah, sure.
And then continues on, and then we see it in the Senate hearings.
Because, as you said, Roswell at the time isn't the story that it becomes later.
No.
Not even interpreted by some to be the story that it becomes later.
Not until 78, by which point this story's been around for over 25 years.
And this is that story.
Yeah, this is the story that we associate with Roswell.
So now this story becomes that story.
The other possibility, of course, is that this story is faked and then a real thing happens that's almost exactly the same.
Yeah. Which is, though,
It's not impossible, but I don't think it's likely.
It's not impossible, but then again, if we go back to the Roswell incident, what does the farmer find?
Tinfoil,
tinfoil,
sticks,
lumber, elastic
rubber,
bands,
tape.
Tape. Not your typical, at least what I imagine would be your typical alien technology.
Although maybe that betrays our lack of imagination.
Yes,
maybe. It turns out that like duct tape and tinfoil is just the thing to hurtle through an atmosphere at the speed of light, as long as there isn't a small hole in your windshield, in which case you're going to get fried to a crisp.
Yeah. I mean, this is that we always, in these cases, are working with circumstantial evidence. And we also, we can't disprove it 100%. But I think
we ask what is the most likely.
Exactly.
Based on the evidence.
And if you had to really bet money on it, and you knew both of these stories, I think I know where I'd put my money, which is on, this is clearly a hoax, and there's just so much that's going against it for me to believe that.
Yeah, I mean, the Newton story, the Scientist X story, obviously a hoax, obviously a scam, and a grift.
Yeah.
To sell his doodlebug.
Yeah.
And he tried so many grifts afterwards. Like, again, I've got stuff in the 70s where he's still out here in these streets scamming.
Yeah, okay.
Like, scammers got to scam.
Yeah.
But, again, it shows you that once an idea is out there, like, we forget its origins.
Yes.
And
can I give you an example of how that has just happened to me, where a story, this is precisely about what you're saying, how sometimes the conspiracy is when we forget the origin story. And so longtime listeners will know about the fake conspiracy started, I think it was 2017, birds aren't real. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I remember you and I having a discussion about the ethics of this, because again, it was started in a sense, in a way to demonstrate people will believe anything. You got to be more critical. And it was clearly started to be a fake conspiracy. Mm-hmm. I remember thinking at the time and saying at the time, there will be a time in the future where somebody will believe this is a conspiracy, a real one. It happened twice this semester, where students from different classes who don't, as far as I know each other, when we were doing our first kind of meet and greet kind of thing, asked the question, well, what about the conspiracy birds aren't real? I was like, well, here it is. It's 2025. The story started in 2017. 8 years later, the origin has been forgotten, and it is now taking on the life of its own. And I'm telling you, it's going to be a conspiracy. It's going to be one that people believe precisely because just the origin has been lost.
Yeah.